The words hit me like a lightning bolt during what should have been a peaceful Sunday dinner. "Mom, what did you do with the $200,000 I transferred to your account last year?" My fork clattered against the china plate, sending my daughter's famous lasagna sliding across the surface. I stared at Emma, my 38-year-old daughter, trying to process what she just said. $200,000? What are you talking about, sweetheart? The confusion in my voice must have been obvious, but apparently not convincing enough for the man sitting across from me. My son-in-law Derek had gone completely pale, his hands gripping his wineglass so tightly I worried it might shatter. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft chatter of my twin grandsons, Jake and Sam, aged 10, who were thankfully absorbed in their video games in the living room. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because 30 minutes earlier, everything had seemed perfectly normal. Well, as normal as things ever were in the Peterson household. I'd arrived at Emma and Derek's suburban home in Westfield right at 5 p.m., just like I did every second Sunday of the month. Their colonial-style house always impressed me with its manicured lawn and fresh paint, a testament to Derek's success as a financial advisor and Emma's keen eye for design. At 62, I took pride in knowing my daughter had built such a beautiful life for her family. Emma had greeted me with her usual warm hug, though I noticed she seemed more tense than usual. "Mom, you look wonderful," she'd said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Derek's just finishing up some work calls. You know how it is with clients." Derek had emerged from his home office 20 minutes later, still radiating that polished confidence that had made him so successful in his field. At 41, he'd built a thriving practice managing investments for high-net-worth clients. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but I caught something flickering in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. We'd made small talk over cocktails, the usual updates about the boys, soccer season, Emma's volunteer work at the local animal shelter, my bridge club activities. Everything felt routine, comfortable even, despite the undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. Now, sitting in their elegant dining room, with its crystal chandelier casting warm light over the mahogany table, I realized that tension had been building toward this moment all evening. "Mom," Emma said, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when explaining complicated things to the boys. "Last March, I transferred $200,000 from our investment account to your checking account. We discussed it over lunch at Romano's, you remember, that little Italian place you love. You said you wanted to help with the boys' future college expenses and maybe do some traveling." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be banking records. "I have the transaction confirmation right here. The money was transferred on March 15th. My stomach dropped somewhere around my ankles. Last March, Emma had indeed taken me to lunch at Romano's. We'd talked about the boys' futures, about how proud I was of their academic achievements, about how I wished I could contribute more to their education on my fixed income from Social Security and my small teacher's pension. But she had never, not once, mentioned giving me any money, let alone $200,000. "Emma, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. You never gave me any money. And trust me, I would definitely remember $200,000. That's more than I made in 5 years of teaching." The wine glass in Derek's hand finally gave up the fight, shattering against the hardwood floor in an explosion of crystal and red wine. "Oh, God," Emma gasped, jumping up to clean the mess. "I'm so clumsy tonight. I don't know what's wrong with me." But Derek wasn't looking at the broken glass. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. "Mom," he said, and the way he said that word made my skin crawl, "I need you to think very carefully about what you're saying. There are some irregularities in our financial accounts that we need to get to the bottom of. If you've invested that money somewhere or moved it for safekeeping, you need to tell us right now. Irregularities. The room started to spin slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Derek, I swear to you both, I have never received any money from you. Check my bank statements. Look at my apartment. Do I look like someone who has $200,000 hidden away somewhere? Emma had finished cleaning up the wine and was standing behind her chair, her hands shaking slightly. Mom, if you didn't receive the money, then where did it go? The transaction shows it was completed. The funds left our account. That's when we heard the sound that made everyone in the room freeze. The doorbell, followed immediately by heavy, authoritative knocking. Derek stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. Derek Peterson? FBI, we need to speak with you about some financial irregularities we've discovered. The FBI. Emma's face went from confusion to pure terror as the reality of our situation began to sink in. Through the window, I could see unmarked cars parked on their quiet suburban street, and neighbors beginning to peer out from behind their curtains. Derek, I whispered, what have you done? But even as I asked the question, pieces were beginning to fall into place in my mind. Derek's recent stress, Emma's unusual behavior tonight, the timing of this dinner conversation. This wasn't a random audit or investigation. They had known this was coming. The knocking grew more insistent. Mr. Peterson, we know you're home. Please open the door. Derek looked at Emma, and in that look I saw something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't surprise or confusion. This was the look of people who had been expecting this moment and had been preparing for it. Emma moved toward the front door, her shoulders set with determination. But before she reached it, she turned back to look at me with an expression that broke my heart. I'm sorry, Mom, she said quietly. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this. As the door opened and federal agents filed into the house that had felt like home just moments before, I realized that my daughter and son-in-law hadn't been victims of some financial crime. They had been the perpetrators, and somehow they were planning to make me the scapegoat. The FBI agents were exactly what you'd expect from television dramas, except far more intimidating, because they were standing in my daughter's foyer with real badges and expressions that meant business. Agent Sarah Mitchell was probably around my age, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that made everyone in the room instinctively step back. Her partner, Agent James Rodriguez, looked like he could bench press a truck. Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson, Agent Mitchell said, settling into Emma's pristine white chair like she owned the place. We appreciate your cooperation. As we discussed on the phone, we're investigating several financial irregularities connected to your investment accounts. I caught the phrase, as we discussed on the phone, and felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Derek had known they were coming. He'd arranged this dinner, this confrontation, about the missing money, knowing federal investigators would show up. My own daughter and son-in-law had set me up. Now Mrs. Helen Carter. Agent Mitchell turned her attention to me, using my full name in a way that made it sound like an accusation. Your daughter claims she transferred $200,000 to your account 11 months ago. Our records show the money left their investment account, but it never appeared in any account registered under your name or social security number. I straightened in my chair, drawing on every ounce of dignity I'd learned in 62 years of life. Agent Mitchell, I can provide you with every bank statement, every financial record I have. I'm a retired elementary school teacher living on Social Security and a small pension. If I had $200,000, I wouldn't be shopping at discount stores and using coupons for groceries. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. Mrs. Carter, money laundering and financial fraud are federal crimes. If you've helped conceal or move funds to avoid detection, the penalties are severe regardless of your age or financial situation. I haven't laundered anything except my bed sheets, I said, immediately regretting the attempt at humor. This wasn't the time for jokes, even if the situation felt surreal. Agent Mitchell consulted her notes. The transfer was initiated from your daughter's investment account on March 15th. The receiving account was registered under your name with your Social Security number, but the account was opened using an address in Millbrook, not your current residence in Westfield Heights, Millbrook. My heart started racing for a different reason now. Derek's business partner, Marcus, lived in Millbrook. Derek had mentioned several times how Marcus was always talking about the benefits of small-town banks, with better interest rates and more personalized service. I glanced at Derek, who had been unusually quiet since the agents arrived. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, but I could see a muscle ticking in his jaw, the same nervous tell he'd had since marrying Emma 8 years ago. "Derek," I said slowly, watching his face carefully, "didn't you mention that Marcus opened some kind of business account in Millbrook? Something about better rates for investment funds?" Emma looked confused. "What business account? Derek, we keep everything at First National." Derek's composure cracked just slightly. "I might have mentioned exploring options. Interest rates vary so much between institutions." Agent Rodriguez made a note. "Mr. Peterson, are you authorized to open financial accounts using your mother-in-law's personal information?" The question hung in the air like a sword about to drop. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I would never. That would be identity theft. Why would you suggest such a thing?" But I was remembering things now. How Derek had offered to help me organize my finances after my husband Robert died 3 years ago. How he'd insisted on having copies of my important documents for, quote, estate planning purposes. How he'd somehow known my Social Security number when the boys' school needed it for their emergency contact forms. "Agent Mitchell," I said, "I think you need to look very carefully at who actually opened that account in Millbrook." Derek stared at me with what I could only describe as panic. "Helen, surely you're not suggesting that I—" "Derek Peterson," Agent Mitchell interrupted. "We have security footage from Millbrook Community Bank showing you making deposits and withdrawals from the account in question. We also have copies of the identification you used, which appears to be a fraudulent driver's license bearing Helen Carter's name, but your photograph." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Derek's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, resignation, like he was cycling through different lies and realizing none of them would work. "That's impossible," Derek whispered. "You must be mistaken." Agent Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and swiped to a video file. "March 18th, 3 days after the initial transfer. You deposited the funds and immediately wrote checks to 3 different entities." He turned the screen so we could all see. There was Derek, clear as day, conducting business at a bank teller window. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time when he should have been at his office meeting with clients. The checks were written to Premium Properties, LLC for $75,000, Peterson Investment Strategies for $100,000, and a cash withdrawal of $25,000. Peterson Investment Strategies. I'd never heard of that business before, but judging by Emma's expression, she hadn't either. "Derek?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What is Peterson Investment Strategies?" Derek had gone completely still, like a deer caught in headlights, but I could practically see his mind racing behind his eyes, still looking for an angle, still trying to figure out which lie would cause the least damage. Agent Mitchell consulted her tablet again. "Peterson Investment Strategies appears to be a limited liability company registered in Delaware 8 months ago. The registered address is a P.O. box in Millbrook, and the sole proprietor is listed as Derek Peterson." She looked up at my son-in-law with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen this type of financial maneuvering before. "It appears to be a shell company designed to funnel money away from legitimate accounts." "Shell company?" Emma stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "Derek, you don't have a separate business. We're partners in your financial advisory practice." His voice was rising now, and I could see 10-year-old Jake peeking around the corner from the living room, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. This was probably the first time he'd ever heard his parents raise their voices, let alone seen FBI agents in his home. "Maybe the boys should go upstairs," I suggested gently, trying to provide some normalcy in a situation that had gone completely off the rails. "No," Emma said firmly. "They're old enough to understand that their father is apparently a criminal." Derek's careful composure finally shattered completely. "Don't you dare talk to me like that in front of my children. I did this for us, for our family's future. Do you have any idea how precarious our financial situation really is?" "Precarious?" Emma's voice cracked. "Derek, your practice brings in over $800,000 a year. We live in a house worth $650,000. How is that precarious?" Agent Mitchell cleared her throat. "Actually, our investigation suggests that Mr. Peterson has been systematically moving money from various client accounts over the past 18 months. The $200,000 in question was just the most recent transaction." I felt like I was watching a movie where the plot kept twisting in directions no one could predict. Derek hadn't just stolen money using my identity. He'd been stealing from his own clients, and he'd used my name and information to hide his crimes. "Various accounts?" Emma's face had gone pale. "What other accounts?" Derek finally seemed to realize that his situation was hopeless. His perfect posture sagged, and he sank back into his chair like a deflated balloon. "The college funds," he said quietly. "Jake and Sam's college funds. Some client investment accounts that were supposed to be in long-term holdings." Each admission came out softer than the last, like he was running out of energy to maintain the lies. "How much?" Emma asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. Agent Mitchell answered instead. "Our preliminary investigation shows approximately $1.8 million moved through fraudulent accounts over the past 18 months. $1.8 million. I couldn't even comprehend that number. I'd worked for 35 years as a teacher and never made more than $45,000 in any single year. Derek had stolen more money than I could earn in multiple lifetimes. And he'd used my identity to do it." "Premium properties," I said, remembering one of the companies Agent Rodriguez had mentioned. "What is Premium Properties?" Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Premium Properties, LLC, is a real estate investment company based in Miami. They specialize in luxury vacation rentals and commercial properties in South Florida." Emma stared at her husband with an expression of complete betrayal. "You bought property in Florida with stolen money?" "It's not stolen." Derek's voice rose to nearly a shout. "It's client money that I was investing on their behalf. Those properties are going to double in value over the next 5 years. Everyone would have gotten their money back with significant returns." "Using my mother's identity to open fraudulent accounts?" Emma was shouting now, too. "Derek, this is federal fraud, not some risky investment strategy." I'd been quiet through most of this exchange, trying to process the magnitude of what Derek had done. He'd used my name, my social security number, my entire identity to create a financial house of cards that was now collapsing around all of us. But there was something else bothering me, something that didn't quite add up. "Derek," I said, cutting through their argument, "how did you know the FBI was coming tonight?" Everyone turned to look at me. Agent Mitchell raised an eyebrow, clearly interested in my question. "What do you mean?" Derek asked, but I could see panic flickering in his eyes again. "You said on the phone that the agents were early. That means you knew they were coming. You arranged this dinner, this confrontation about the money, knowing that federal investigators would show up." The room went dead silent. Even Jake and Sam, who I now realized were both listening from the hallway, seemed to understand the significance of what I'd just said. Emma looked from me to her husband, the pieces falling into place. "Derek, did you know about the investigation?" Derek's hands were shaking now. "I got a call from someone at the bank," They said there were questions about some accounts, that investigators might want to talk to us. I thought if we could just explain about the money, if we could show it was a family transaction. You were going to let me take the blame, I said, and it wasn't a question. You stole nearly $2 million using my identity, and you were going to sit there and let me go to federal prison for it. As the weight of Derek's betrayal settled over the room like a dark cloud, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. The house felt like a crime scene after the FBI agents left with Derek in handcuffs. Emma sat at her kitchen island, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, while Jake and Sam huddled together in the living room, trying to process why their father had been arrested. I'd offered to take the boys to my apartment for the night, but Emma insisted they all needed to stay together and figure out what came next. I should have known, Emma kept repeating like a broken record. The signs were all there. How could I have been so blind? I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that love makes us vulnerable to deception, that trusting your spouse isn't a character flaw, but honestly, I was still processing my own emotions. Derek had been willing to let me go to federal prison to cover his crimes. That level of calculated cruelty was hard to comprehend, even from someone who'd been part of our family for 8 years. Emma, I said gently, settling into the chair across from her, beating yourself up won't help anything. We need to focus on protecting the boys and understanding exactly what Derek has done. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past few hours. Mom, do you understand what this means? The business investigation could destroy everything Derek built, even if the clients get their money back. The scandal alone could ruin our reputation. Who's going to trust a financial advisor whose husband was stealing from clients? I'd been thinking about that during the long hour after Derek was taken away. Have you talked to Derek's business partner, Marcus, recently? Not since he called about some accounting discrepancies last month. Why? Because Agent Mitchell mentioned that the fraudulent account was opened in Millbrook, where Marcus lives. Emma, what if Marcus wasn't Derek's accomplice? What if he was trying to protect the business? Emma blinked at me like she was seeing me clearly for the first time all evening. You think Marcus knew Derek was stealing? I think Marcus discovered someone was moving money from client accounts and chose to report it to authorities rather than handle it internally. That suggests he was trying to establish a clear record that the business itself wasn't corrupt. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Carter, this is Agent Mitchell. We'll need to speak with you tomorrow about pressing charges for identity theft. Please call our office first thing in the morning. Identity theft. Just seeing those words made my stomach clench. Derek hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my entire identity to commit federal crimes. My name was on fraudulent accounts, fake identification documents, business registrations I'd never authorized. Even though I was clearly a victim, untangling this mess was going to take months, possibly years. Mom? Emma said, noticing my expression. What is it? I showed her the text. I have to decide whether to press additional charges against Derek for identity theft. Of course you're pressing charges. He tried to frame you for federal crimes. But it wasn't that simple, and we both knew it. Derek was still the father of my grandsons. Jake and Sam had already learned their father was a criminal who'd stolen from his clients. Did they need to watch him face even more serious charges because of what he'd done to me? Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, his overnight bag slung over his shoulder. Grandma Helen, are you going to send Dad to prison for longer? The question hit me like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his father is a criminal who was willing to let his grandmother take the blame for his crimes? Jake, honey, your father made some very serious choices that hurt a lot of people. There are consequences for those choices. But you could choose not to press extra charges, right? Jake's eyes were red from crying, but his voice was steady. You could just let the FBI handle the client stuff and not make it worse. Sam joined his brother in the doorway. Jake, Dad stole Grandma's identity. He was going to let her go to prison. How is that not worse? I looked at these two boys, caught in the middle of an adult disaster they'd had no part in creating, and felt my heart break a little more. But then I thought about what Derek had done, the calculated cruelty of it, the months of planning required to execute such elaborate fraud using my personal information. "I need some time to think about it," I said finally. Emma walked the boys out to my car, loading their overnight bags into the trunk while I gathered my purse and coat. As I was heading for the door, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Derek's sister, Amanda. "Helen, thank God." Amanda's voice was frantic. "I just heard what happened. Derek called me from the holding facility. He says this is all a misunderstanding, that there's been some kind of banking error. Even from jail, Derek was still spinning lies, still trying to manipulate the narrative to make himself look like the victim. Amanda, Derek stole nearly $2 million from his clients using fraudulent accounts opened with my identity. The FBI has security footage and documentation. There's no misunderstanding. But he's my brother, Helen. He's got 2 children. Surely you can work something out, family to family." Family to family. The irony was almost painful. Derek had been willing to destroy our family to protect himself, but now I was supposed to show family loyalty to save him. "Amanda, Derek made his choices. Now he has to live with the consequences." After I hung up, I stood in Emma's driveway looking around at the neighborhood Derek had bought with money stolen from his clients. Everything here was tainted now, built on a foundation of lies and theft. But as I drove to my apartment where Jake and Sam were waiting, I realized something important. Derek's crimes had revealed something ugly about human nature, but they'd also revealed something beautiful. Marcus had risked his own business to report the fraud. Emma was more concerned about doing the right thing than protecting her husband from consequences. The boys themselves were struggling with questions of justice versus family loyalty. Derek had tried to destroy our family with his greed and deception. But families, real families, are stronger than the worst thing any one member can do. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment with both boys asleep in sleeping bags on my living room floor. My 2-bedroom place had never felt more like home than it did watching my grandsons find comfort in my simple, honest space after the mansion of lies they'd been living in. The coffee was brewing when my phone rang at 7:30. Emma, sounding like she hadn't slept at all. "Mom, I've been up all night thinking about what Derek said, about our financial situation being precarious. I went through all our accounts and investment records. He wasn't lying about that part." "What do you mean?" "We're leveraged to the hilt. The house has a massive mortgage, there are business loans against the practice, and our personal savings are practically non-existent. Everything we own is tied up in investments that Derek managed." I poured my coffee, settling into my kitchen chair with the phone pressed to my ear. "Emma, that sounds like Derek was living beyond your means and using client money to maintain your lifestyle. That's what I'm afraid of." "Mom, I think Derek has been stealing from clients for years, not just the past 18 months. I think our entire life has been built on other people's money." The implications of what Emma was saying hit me like ice water. Derek hadn't been a successful financial advisor who'd made some recent bad decisions. He'd been operating a systematic fraud for years, using client investments to fund his family's expensive lifestyle, while moving money through fraudulent accounts to hide his crimes. "Emma, if that's true, then you and the boys might lose everything." "I know. The house, the cars, the boys, private school tuition. It all has to be paid back to his victims. We might end up with nothing." But there was something else in Emma's voice that gave me hope. Determination. My daughter was already thinking about how to rebuild their lives, honestly, rather than how to hold on to things bought with stolen money. "Mom, there's something else. I found some documents in Derek's home office that I don't understand. Financial records for accounts I've never seen before, and correspondence with someone named Victoria Chen." Victoria Chen. I didn't recognize the name, but something about Emma's tone suggested this was important. "What kind of correspondence?" "It looks like business communications. but they're talking about targets and acquisition timelines. And Mom, some of these documents have information about you, your daily routine, your bank account details, even photos of you at the grocery store. My blood ran cold. Derek hadn't just stolen my identity on impulse. He'd been researching and documenting my life for months, possibly years, preparing to use me as a scapegoat for his crimes. Emma, I think you need to turn those documents over to the FBI immediately. Already done. Agent Mitchell is coming by this morning to collect everything. But Mom, I think Derek's crimes are bigger than anyone realizes. And I think there might be other people involved. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to my grandson sleeping and thinking about the man who'd been part of our family for 8 years. I'd never loved Derek exactly, but I'd respected him as Emma's choice, as the father of my grandchildren. I'd tried to build a relationship with him, to be the kind of mother-in-law who was helpful without being intrusive. Looking back now, I could see that Derek had never wanted a relationship with me. He'd wanted access to my personal information, to my trust, to my identity. Every kindness I'd extended, every document I'd shared, every piece of personal information I'd given him, he'd cataloged and saved for potential criminal use. My phone rang again. Agent Mitchell. Mrs. Carter, I hope you've had time to consider pressing identity theft charges, but there's something else we need to discuss. Based on the documents your daughter provided this morning, we believe Derek's criminal network may be larger than we initially understood. A criminal network. Derek's crimes weren't just individual fraud. They were part of something bigger, more organized, more dangerous than I'd imagined. What kind of network? We're still investigating, but it appears Derek may have been working with associates to target elderly victims specifically. Your case might not be isolated, Mrs. Carter. There may be other families who've been victimized the same way. Other families. Derek and his associates had been systematically targeting elderly people for financial fraud, using the same techniques he'd used on me. Agent Mitchell, what do you need me to do? First, we need you to come in and formally press charges for identity theft. But, Mrs. Carter, we may also need your help identifying other potential victims and understanding how this network operates. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Derek's attempt to make me a victim had actually revealed my strength and resourcefulness. Instead of being destroyed by his crimes, I was becoming instrumental in stopping a criminal network that had been victimizing families like mine. Derek had made the fatal mistake of underestimating his intended victim. He was about to learn that some grandmothers fight back harder than anyone expects. 3 months after that devastating Sunday dinner, I stood in federal court watching Derek's carefully constructed world finally collapse completely. The courtroom was packed with his victims and their families, FBI agents, prosecutors, and journalists covering what had become known as the Peterson investment fraud case. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and older than I remembered, wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to drain all the confidence from his demeanor. The 8 years he'd spent playing the role of successful financial advisor seemed like a different lifetime now that everyone could see who he really was. Judge Robert Harrison reviewed the sentencing documents with an expression of barely controlled disgust. Derek Peterson, you have systematically defrauded your clients, violated their trust, and used your mother-in-law's identity to conceal your crimes for over 3 years. The damage you've caused extends far beyond financial loss. The final tally was staggering. 18 clients had lost a combined total of $3.2 million. Derek's fraudulent network, which included Victoria Chen and 2 other associates, had been targeting elderly victims across 3 states. Most shocking of all, Derek had been planning to claim I was suffering from dementia if his identity theft scheme had been discovered, using my age to suggest I was a confused participant rather than an unwilling victim. Derek Peterson, Judge Harrison continued, this court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, 15 years. Derek would be nearly 60 when he got out, and his financial advisory license would be permanently revoked. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built through lies and theft was gone forever. Emma had filed for divorce within a week of Derek's arrest. She'd also voluntarily surrendered their house, cars, and most of their assets to help compensate his victims. The woman I'd raised had chosen to do the right thing, even when it meant losing everything she thought she'd built with Derek. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus Webb took the witness stand to provide victim impact testimony on behalf of Derek's clients. Your Honor, Derek Peterson didn't just steal money from his clients. He stole their trust, their retirement security, and their faith in financial institutions. But his greatest mistake was trying to frame Mrs. Helen Carter because she fought back in ways that Derek never expected. Marcus looked directly at me in the courtroom gallery. Mrs. Carter's courage in cooperating with federal investigators not only protected herself, but helped us recover funds we didn't even know were missing. Because of her willingness to press charges and testify, we were able to trace money that Derek had stolen years ago. Marcus was right. By refusing to accept Derek's attempt to make me a scapegoat, I'd helped uncover the full extent of his crimes and recover money for victims who might never have known they'd been robbed. As the court session ended and Derek was led away in shackles, I found myself thinking about strength and survival. Derek had spent months thinking he could manipulate a vulnerable, elderly woman who would be easy to frame and discard. Instead, he'd awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. Mrs. Carter, Agent Mitchell approached me as we left the courthouse. I wanted you to know that the FBI has used your case as a model for investigating similar financial fraud networks. Your testimony and cooperation have already helped us identify potential victims in other states. My experience as Derek's intended victim had become a resource for protecting other families from similar crimes. The strength I'd discovered in fighting back was now helping elderly people across the country who were facing the same types of threats. Emma and the boys were waiting for me outside the courthouse. Jake and Sam, now 11, had grown up significantly during the months of legal proceedings. They'd learned hard lessons about integrity, consequences, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Grandma Helen, Sam said, hugging me tightly, I'm proud of you for fighting back against Dad. You showed us what real courage looks like. Real courage. For most of my 62 years, I'd thought courage was about enduring difficulties quietly and maintaining family peace at any cost. Derek's crimes had taught me that sometimes courage means fighting back against people who hurt you, even when those people are family. Sam, the most important thing I learned is that being family doesn't mean accepting criminal behavior. Real love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions. Jake, who'd struggled more with conflicted feelings about his father, had come to his own understanding over the months. Grandma, do you think Dad will ever understand what he did wrong? It was a question I'd wrestled with throughout the investigation and trial. Derek had shown no genuine remorse during his court appearances, only anger at being caught and punished. Jake, I think your father understands right from wrong, but he chose to do wrong when it benefited him. That's not something that changes easily, especially after so many years of lying to everyone who trusted him. Emma had been quiet during the exchange, but now she spoke up. Mom, I need you to know how grateful I am. When Derek tried to frame you, you could have just protected yourself. Instead, you helped make sure all his victims got justice. Emma was rebuilding her life from scratch, working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit, while the boys attended public school. They'd moved into a modest apartment, but for the first time in years, their lives were built on honest foundations. Emma, we're family. Real family protects each other from people who would harm us, even when those people are also family. 6 months later, I received a letter that reminded me why fighting back had been so important. It was from Margaret Hoffman, an elderly widow in Connecticut whose savings Derek's network had been targeting when he was arrested. Mrs. Carter, I'll never know how close I came to losing everything I've worked for my entire life. Your courage in fighting back against these criminals saved not just your own family but families like mine across the country. Margaret's letter reminded me that Derek's crimes had extended far beyond our family. By refusing to accept victimization, I'd helped protect other families from experiencing the same trauma. That knowledge was worth more than all the money Derek had ever stolen, and more satisfying than any revenge could have been. Derek had underestimated his intended victim, and it had cost him everything. He'd thought he was targeting a confused elderly woman who would be easy to manipulate and blame. Instead, he'd chosen someone who'd raised a daughter as a single mother, who'd worked for 35 years in education, dealing with difficult parents and administrative challenges, who'd rebuilt her life after losing her husband. He'd forgotten that surviving and thriving for 62 years requires more strength than he'd ever possessed. As I sat in my small apartment that evening, reading Margaret's letter while Jake and Sam did homework at my kitchen table, I realized that Derek's greatest crime hadn't been stealing money. It had been trying to make me believe I was powerless. Some grandmothers, it turns out, are much stronger than they appear. And when they fight back, they don't just protect themselves. They protect everyone who comes after them. Derek Peterson learned that lesson the hard way. 15 years too late. But he learned it nonetheless. The story could have ended with me as his victim. Instead, it ended with him as mine, and with justice for everyone he'd tried to harm. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim someone expects you to be.